Hi there. My name is Stella O'Malley, and I'm a psychotherapist. And I'm very pleased to be able to bring you this presentation, communicating with teens and preteens, because so many teenagers come to me with distress around their communication with their parents, and so many teen parents come to me and they're devastated because they feel lonely because they used to get on so well with their teenagers, and now they find that they're not so connected with them anymore, and it causes huge distress. So this is brought to you by Keep Well Tipperary, which is an initiative. It's a campaign brought to you with thanks to Healthy Ireland, an initiative of the Government of Ireland with funding from the Healthy Ireland Fund and the Sláinte Care Fund delivered by Pubble. And I'm a psychotherapist based in Offaly, and I've written a few books, and I'm often writing in the media, and I've been in a few TV shows. The first book was Cotton Wool Kids, which was released in 2015, and then Bullyproof Kids was released in 2017, and then Fragile, which is about anxiety and stress, which was released in 2019. And I also do a few podcasts. If you want to look me up, I'm easily found online. But I suppose an important part of communicating with teenagers is to be aware that each teenager we meet or preteen, they're in a psychosocial stage. And these stages are very specific, and they there is a reason for them. And the first stage, you land on Earth, let's say, of all of us, psychosocial stages, well developed by the psychologist Eric Erickson. The first stage in life, you're figuring out whether you can trust people. And then you move on and you're in the toddler years and you're figuring out, can you do things on your own? And you realize you're your own person, that actually you're not connected to your caregiver and you can just run. So you might just run out of the supermarket with this great feeling of freedom. And that's why you see toddlers taking off like, bat out of hell. And then you move into the kind of the fourth through the sixth years where you're thinking, am I good girl or am I bad girl? And then an extraordinary time in the kind of primary school years, which is from 6 up until puberty, where you think, what am I good at? And do your child a favor if you have a child between 6 and puberty. Find them something they're good at. It might be problem solving, might be design, might be um, being good with people. It might be creativity. It mightn't necessarily be school or sport. And so many kids, that's the only thing that they feel value in. Find your kid, if they don't happen to be good at those school or sport, find them their own thing, because it really matters in that stage. And finally, up until around about the age of 10, 11, 12, you're telling your children what you can vote, you think of the government, what you think of the healthcare, what you think of the education system, what you think of the neighbours down the road, and what you think of good food and healthy food and things like that. And they're taking it all in like a sponge. And then anything between the ages of 10 and 13, they lean over and turn you off, like you're the radio. They turn you off and they let all the other influences in. And they're right. It's kind of the appropriate developmental stage. It's natural for them to turn you down and turn everybody else up and be influenced by the media, by their friends, by their peers, by social media influencers, by film, by music. And for the next maybe 10 years or so, they're awash with different influences and they're trying on different identities, checking out who they are, so that ultimately in their early 20s or middle 20s, they can become their own person. And they're not a clone of you, and they're not a clone of the peers. And they might seem like a clone of their peers for a little while during these kind of storms and stresses of adolescence, but they're trying on new identities. It's just literally a way of trying things on. And so it's really important that we realize, while the parents feel hurt that they've been turned down and that their influence feels completely negligible, that's what they need to do. They need to turn your sound down so they can listen to other things. That doesn't mean all the values that you gave them has gone and been dumped in the sea. It doesn't mean that they'll never resurrect again. They will flick you back up when they're in their 20s to see if you've anything interesting to say. And from then on, parenting is a long, long, long game. And so you might be a great parent of toddlers and you might be a terrible um, parent of babies. Or you could be brilliant in middle childhood, but terrible in adolescence. And don't forget, there's also adults, parenting the adult child. So some parents, like, they really come into their own. And I know, the poet Maya Angelou said, that her mother was a great mother to her when she was an adult, but she was a terrible mother to her when she was a child. I remember the poet Maya Angelou said that, and I thought that's so interesting. And she said it did make a big difference that she was so great to me when I was an adult. It made a difference. We've got maybe 50 years to do parenting, so you've many years to get it right and to get it wrong, and there'll be lots of things going wrong and lots of things going right, and that's all part of it. So I want everybody to be very aware, if at all possible, of the teenage brain, because the brain of the teenager is like a half-baked cake. It's in the oven, it's lumpy, it's not fully formed. For example, the emotional brain at the back of your head, that's overdeveloped, and the analytical, contemplative, reflective, and wise brain is underdeveloped right up until you reach the age of 25. And so, therefore, we really need to be very conscious that their emotionality is part of their development. That being driven by strong black and white thinking, catastrophic thinking, everything's terrible or brilliant, is all because of literally their brain structure. And you literally have a better brain to deal with. And so when there's high emotion and your teenager is giving you huge emotion, you, the adult, working with the fully functioning, developed brain that has a good, strong, logical brain, perhaps needs to leave the room, or perhaps needs to kind of lead from ahead and say, actually, this child is in huge high emotion, and I need to not lose it myself. I need to not get down and dirty with them and start brawling with them because they don't have a fully functioning brain. I do. Theirs is overdeveloped in the emotional. Mine is nicely balanced, hopefully. And, their amygdala means that they're much more impulsive because of their brain structure. They're much more excited by reward than consequence. They can barely contemplate consequence because that part of the brain isn't developed. And the reward part of the brain is literally on a radar. Bang, bang, bang. Look, reward here, reward there. And that's why they're kind of driven to do things. And they're not even processing information effectively. Now, they are on a massive learning curve, and the laughs you have as a teenager will never probably be, you know, repeated because they're so hysterical and fun. So there's some great things. They learn so much in those years, but it's very emotional, and highly impulsive and reckless. As it says there, like the love lobe is very big, rebellion center is very big. They have to push away the parental influence so they can find themselves. Very low judgment, immature planning. The analytical brain is underdeveloped. High emotionality. The emotional brain is much more powerful. Very excitable reward system, much more excited by rewards than consequences. Low impulse control. They do not have the developed functionality of impulse control. So they do things very impulsively that you might just think, what did you do that for? They did it because the brain isn't fully developed. So they seem so developed in some ways and they aren't. And they will never before or after will they never be more sensitive to social judgment. They really care about their peers. They really care about the judgment of their peers. I do want to include this slide because I want to remind people that some of us are introverts, some of us are extroverts. Introverts get their energy from being alone. Extroverts get their energy from being with people. And if your child is an extrovert, she will probably wilt if she is on her own too much. And the corollary, if your child is an introvert, they will probably wilt if they're with people too much. And school is a very extroverted place. And so sometimes introverts kind of wilt in the school system, and they often fall into their screens as a way of protecting themselves from the school system because they get so beaten by it and so tired out by it. So that might be the child who needs more time on their own. They need more quiet time. So you might send them into the sitting room on their own and be careful around the screens because of that, because screens can be such a debilitating impact on a child's ability to communicate. So again, the teenage brain, a huge level of cognitive and emotional flux. Crazy things are going on. You are dealing with much better card as an adult than they are dealing with a teenager brain. Many mental disorders first appear in the teenage years. So the really serious disorders, when you're in serious water, often first appear in the teenage years. And you look back thinking, oh yeah, that's where the trouble started. So you do have to give some room in a way for real distress might be happening. The decision making skills aren't fully developed. They're not fully able to make good long lasting, mature decisions. They're not functionally able. They're self centered, but they're also lovely because they're so idealistic. So they can be very self absorbed, but have a beautiful concern in the larger because they're full of emotion. They can really care about the homeless or really care about climate change. And I really do urge parents who are having difficulty communicating, discuss their passions. So if they're mad about climate change, get into it with them, or if they're very concerned about Africa or something, get into it with them, because their idealism is a lovely way in to communicating with them. They're very self conscious. They can be prone to impulsivity and risk taking, especially in the company of their peers. They've done studies of, boys with simulated racing cars, and they go through red lights, they drive faster. If they're with their peers, they will take much more reckless decisions than if they're on their own. Hence, all the dangerous things that groups of teenagers do. Likely to be socially influenced, part of that. Dramatic, emotional, intense, black and white thinking. You can see why they're so mad. There's a very well known story in psychology circles of a neuroscientist who was looking at brain scans of psychotic patients, and he asked his intern to go through the brain scans. And he said, "You'll be able to see, the psychotic patients through the brain scan." And he said, but be very aware of their date of birth. Because if they're teenagers, if it's a teenage brain, you will think they're psychotic, but they're not. It's just that it's a teenage brain. That is what we're dealing with the teenage brain. They are really undeveloped, emotional, black and white thinking, very exciting, roller coaster all the time. And it can be absolutely exhausting. And so parents need to look after themselves because it can be so exhausting. So the basics of communication, there's a sender, there's that might be you who has a message to impart. There's a receiver, that might be the teenager. There's the message, which you have to make sure that you're very clear about it. There's the code. How do you speak? Is it subtly? Is it straight? Is it with humor? Is it yelling? What is your code? The medium, that could be through speech, it could be through a text, it could be through a hug. There's lots of different ways to communicate your message. The noise, watch out for the noise in the background. Do they work better around noise? And do they hear better around the noise? If they're extroverted, they might, and vice versa. Then they might need the quiet. Their environment, some people's environment really matters to them. If I really want to hear somebody, I need a quiet environment. And feedback, listen to the feedback. We're so intent on getting our message across, we miss what they said, and what they said might be pivotal to your way forward. So I do want to kind of people to be aware of when you've got something serious to communicate, to take it seriously and be quite strategic, especially if communication is broken down. Maya Angelou, who I mentioned earlier on, she's a lovely quote about communication where she said, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And when you communicate with your children, whether they're preteen or teen, you are making them feel. You might be making them feel loved. You might make them feel confident. You might be making them feel warm, or you might be making them feel stupid or annoying or in the way. And how you make them feel is so much more important than the words you use. And how you make them feel is kind of from your vibe, your energy you have towards them. So be very, very careful about how, when you leave the room, think, how did I make them feel? Not what you said, not what you did, but how did you make the people behind me feel? And it's a really kind of, it's a really good test of whether you're communicating, because so many people communicate with their energy, people communicate with their physicality, people communicate with their face, their facial expressions, their body language. And some people just communicate with the verbal, with what the words they say. So when you've got a piece of information that you want to communicate, first of all, figure out the main point. Try and get one point. If you've got 10 things to say, maybe do 10 different incidents. Try to get it quite clear that there's one thing you really want to say, and hold that space and get that communication over. Consider how the person understands best and use this approach. Some people would be very physical, so you need to give them their favorite dinner and warm the house and give them their blankie and put on the fire and say, now I want to have a chat with you. You need the whole physicality. Well, somebody else, it'll be all about the words you use. So be careful about who are you speaking to and who are you communicating with. Encourage and listen to the response. It'll be verbal and non-verbal. It might be a look. It might be their hand. They might look out to you. Their eyes might roll. Watch out for the response, and it might not be verbal. Use an anecdote if appropriate. Sometimes it can be really, really helpful to have a story that backs it up. As in, your Uncle John was just like this, and you give a kind of an anecdote that you've thought about that really matters. For some people, that would work a dream. For some people, it would be an absolute disaster. So you need to be very careful of, would it work for the person to whom I'm saying this communication, and come away with something, a firm, a clear outline or plan. Come away with something so that when you've got one piece of information you want to communicate, maybe your communication is you're hanging around with a bad group and they're really making you unhappy. So that's your communication. You find your space. You figure out what's the best way to communicate with them. You might use an anecdote from your own childhood when you hung around with a bad crowd and they made you feel unhappy, or you mightn't. Depends on the person. And then a clear plan. So it might be something like, can we check in a month and you tell me whether it's got better or whether it's got worse, or whether they are being kind to you or whether they're not. So you get something to walk away with, some sort of kind of, we will be checking on this, or you will be doing something. There will be something going away from it. So there's different levels of communication, intimacy as such. And probably the best way to communicate, I as a psychotherapist would of course say talking, because it is the most powerful perhaps. But then there's also video chat, and a lot of people use that, especially if they're broken up with their partner, and so they mightn't see their children every day. There's phone calls; they're also very effective. Text messages probably less effective, but they keep your hand in. When the relationship is turning quite cold, it might be by email or through chat messages, or commenting on Facebook status or things like that. And then ultimately goes further down the chain to kind of different parts of social media. And you might need that when your child has gotten like 16 years old and has completely closed up. And the only way you can communicate with them is through social media. Well, then take it, because it's yet another way of communicating. But if you have issues around digital and technological kind of hygiene in the house, be careful around it, because a lot of households, they might be very healthy with the food they take, they might be very healthy with their living, and then they have allowed a digital sprawl to kind of take over the household, so that people are looking at their phones on the kitchen table and people are going to sleep with the phones under their pillow. So many children have huge issues around communication because their parents haven't got enough guidance or control over their tech. And so here's a few parental controls. The circle is great. iKids, RPAC. There's lots of different parental controls for the internet. And I really urge people to kind of consider using them. If you look at these pictures, you'll see how children change over their course of maybe pre-teens to the teens. It starts so cutely and so sweetly and so innocently with little images that they're doing when they're 9 and 10, and then they get a little bit older. Selfies, a lot of kind of vanity is coming in at this stage. Then it's very narcissistic and it's moved in, and often moves to sexting where there's upset. That's quite a common sequence of events. Sweetness, cute, vanity, and narcissism. So there is huge issues associated with the overuse of technology among teenagers. More than anything, they have problems with communication. They're more comfortable messaging their best friend than talking to them. They're more comfortable taking pictures than communicating on a deep level. And those lovely conversations you might have had with when you were a teenager aren't being had as often, because so many of them don't have the physical freedom that you might have had, and they're in their bedrooms and they're messaging each other, and it's not as deep and it's not as warm. A lot of them become very vain. They become a bit numb to violence very often. A distorted view of sexuality. Their sexual kind of awakenings is done over a phone, which isn't really very developmentally appropriate and physically satisfying. They can become bored, looking for thrills online, and more than anything, become very disaffected, very alienated. They feel like their friends are better online, sex is better online, everything's better online, everybody's funnier online, and they don't see a point in living a kind of a more outward life. And there's, if you wanted to make a sweeping generalization, you'd say the boys are prone towards more violence if they're on tech too much, and the girls are prone to more vanity. Huge generalization, but it's also quite a common one. As this quote says, I'm better online, my friends are better online, the sex is better online, and that shuts down communication, shuts down deep communication. I do want to say that if your child is in distress, more than anything, if you can be aware of what Brené Brown said, which is, the truth is rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. When we are trying to communicate with our children, the most important thing is to get down in the trenches, to actually be part of them, and to be willing to kind of to be part of their distress by connecting with it, as opposed to just staying on high and saying you should get your life in gear. It's much harder, it takes much more bravery to kind of say, oh, that's really hard, I can see where you are, it's really difficult, and to connect with them. It does take that extra brain space, but it's really, really important. So I hope you benefited from this talk. It was brought to you by Keep Well Tipperary, and it's a campaign brought to you with thanks to Healthy Ireland, an initiative of the Government of Ireland with funding from the Healthy Ireland Fund and the Sláinte Céard Fund, delivered by Pubble. Thank you very much.